Now, nation-state attacks, is it always the same countries, and I will not mention any names, or are we witnessing the capability of many nations increasing due to the support of the private sectors? I will still not mention any names. I would like to welcome Mr. Raj Samani from McAfee to talk about the League of Nations. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay. So, I want you to have a wonderful vacation, but I want you to take your phone with you. Every single time you go away, that's what we're told, right? I normally ask the audience the question, how many times have you been asked that? But I think for this audience, we're not even asked anymore, it's expected. And so I remember it was Christmas 2016, and part of me was actually expecting a phone call from the Ukraine, thinking, okay, we've got another outage. But actually, remarkably, this Christmas, or actually the 2016 Christmas, was really quiet. And then a few days pass, and I get a phone call from one of my team. We've got an attack, and it's an attack that's targeting the Winter Olympic Games. I'm like, well, so what? I mean, we all expected phishing emails related to the Winter Olympics, the Summer Olympics, the World Cup, every earthquake, every disaster. We all expect these types of attacks to occur. But as we began to look into it, there were some things that we found that I thought were remarkable. Now, many of you might have seen this particular headline. That was actually by Andy Greenberg at Wired, who covered the research for us. But what was remarkable about this, it wasn't just a normal phishing attack. What we saw was a level of capability that I think was rather remarkable. And I talk about innovation, but actually what we saw here was the use of a PowerShell script. Now that's not necessarily new, but they were actually leveraging this concept of steganography. Now, steganography is not new in itself. It's the ability to be able to use images and hide data within images. But the most remarkable thing about this was the campaign actually began on the 20th of December. Now, on the 27th of December, so 7 days later, I'm still enjoying Christmas at this time, by the way, but on the 27th of December, the campaign completely changed. The attack completely changed. And here's what the adversaries did. They used a tool, it's listed down there. This tool was actually released on the 20th of December. They downloaded the tool, analyzed the tool. They geared it up to launch a campaign against 337 organizations. They did a QA check and they rolled it out. That's in 7 days. Now, this is an honest question. How many of you work for an organization that can develop and roll out new applications to your customers within 7 days? Is there a single person here that's willing to put their hand up and be embarrassed? No, of course not. That's an adversary that's able to do that in 7 days. They are more agile than the defenders by a mile. And not only that, they were able to obfuscate all elements of their code. Now, we actually collaborated with Intezer, so the research that was shown earlier was work that we actually collaborated on. And you have these adversaries that are able to go to, I called it like a virtual swap mart, but the ability to be able to reuse code is just remarkable. And in the case of North Korea, they were able to take all of this investment that they've been doing in digital warfare and completely remodify their operations. And as we can see, they've actually created multiple units to specifically go after organizations and nations across the globe. So for example, the development and creation of these tools is handled by Unit 110. When you read about these attacks going after banks and these SWIFT attacks going all across the world, They've actually got a unit dedicated to that. You know, the most frustrating thing for me is when I read a story about a cyber attack and I see an image of a young teen with a hood. I don't think anyone's put one up today, by the way, so I think I'm in good space. But what frustrates me more than anything is that there is a misconception amongst general society that the adversaries that we're dealing with are young adolescent boys. And the reality is we're dealing with nations who have migrated traditional warfare investment over to digital means because you have non-repudiation. You can deny it was you in the first place. And the use of the reuse of code that makes things even muddier than it ever was before. And of course, this was the example that was provided earlier. Now I know what you're thinking, but it's North Korea. It's DPRK, it's the Lazarus Group. They've been the most active. But actually, this was actually taken in October 2017. This was actually an attack taken by the Fancy Bear Group, in other words, the group known as Russia. And what was remarkable about this was a campaign that we actually found, and this was actually exploiting a vulnerability called DDE, the Dynamic Data Exchange vulnerability. Now, I want you to think about this. I think it was September that Proofpoint published research about the vulnerability. A week later, I think Microsoft denied it was a vulnerability and called it a feature. What's new? And then, by the end of October, this threat actor had gone out and deployed it and targeted Western military personnel, military personnel from the United States based in Western Europe. That's in about 4 weeks. Now, how do you think this threat actor knew about the vulnerability? Any ideas? They read a blog. And I always ask this question because, and I'm not going to embarrass you, but we as an industry are faced with more content than we can deal with. So many of the community probably didn't even read the blog. Some of us weren't even aware that it happened. But the most remarkable element of this is that the tweets that we do, the blogs that we write, the webcasts that we hold, the sheets, the data sheets that we release about our products, they're all available, accessible to anybody, even the adversary. And the adversary are using this against us. You know, I don't think I've ever come across a PowerPoint from APT1 to APT38 or any of these groups telling us about their plans. Now, I know they have Twitter channels. We were quite fortunate in terms of releasing a decryptor for GandCrab yesterday, but they don't tell us what they're doing. And this really, to me, kind of summarizes the biggest challenge that we face in our industry, which is the asymmetry of information. They know everything, almost everything that we're doing. We hold conferences, we hold talks, we post things on Twitter, we release blogs, and they use this against us, clearly and evidently here. And then on the flip side, we know nothing about them. Absolutely nothing. We speculate, we argue amongst ourselves, but generally speaking, we know nothing at all. So this, to me, is one of the biggest challenges that we face. And we're seeing this thing being played out constantly and consistently. Threat actor groups have the ability to be able to harness major events, leverage zero-day vulnerabilities, well, zero-day exploits. They have these abilities because this is the system and the environment that we've created. Now, we've talked about Russia, we've talked about North Korea. Any other countries we should talk about? Offensive cyber operations, okay. Usually we hear China. Often we'll hear Iran, right? We can talk about Shamoon all day. But I want to kind of burst the bubble here. Everybody's at it. Every nation, whether small, whether large, whether financially powerful, whether financially motivated even, every single nation is at it. Now, this is not new, by the way. This is actually information taken from Citizen Lab. So on the left-hand side, we have the Finfisher spyware, and on the right-hand side, we have the hacking team. Now, the most remarkable thing about the findings here, and I say findings, this was 2 companies that were unfortunately compromised. Both of these companies produce, let's just say, offensive software. Offensive software, not offensive software. You get my drift, right? Although actually, maybe the same thing. They produce software that is offensive in nature. And did anybody actually read and have a look at some of the disclosed data from both of these companies? It was absolutely remarkable. Because here you had gigabytes and gigabytes of information relating to the types of products that they sell, the versions that they have, their customers, job titles, where they work. And it provides you with a level of insight into countries that you wouldn't automatically have assumed that conduct offensive cyber operations. And yet the reality is that these nations, these smaller nations that may not have the technical capability, are just simply going out and purchasing off-the-shelf software to go out and conduct operations against citizens within their nation or possibly outside of their nations as well. I'm going to quote Lily Allen, but she has a wonderful line in one of her songs, and she says, "Everybody's doing it, so why aren't we?" Well, everybody is doing it. And this misconception and this media kind of witch hunt against countries with a red flag, it seems, but this witch hunt against these countries with a red flag needs to be addressed. Yes, certainly a lot of the attacks and campaigns that we've seen seem to have code which goes back and has references to APT28. So what? Many other nations are doing this, and later on I'm going to disclose something for everybody today as well about a new piece of research that we've done. And this is just the issue that we have. The reality is that, and this is actually taken from Cyber Reason, but there's an increase in nation states using third parties. There was a remarkable statement taken from Troels Orting, who was the head of the European Cybercrime Center at the time. And he said a number of years ago, he goes, there's 40 to 50 cybercrime groups out there, and we know who they are. Just think about that for a second. This is an outsourced economy. The perception that you have a developer writing a piece of malware in his basement and then hitting send is 10 years old. I want you to do me a favor. If you ever go to a talk and you see somebody with a slide which has hacktivists, cyber criminals, nation states, and capability with a little bar chart, you know the one, right? You've all seen it. That's 10 years ago thinking. The hacktivist is the criminal. The criminal is the nation state operative. They collaborate, they work together. It depends what they're doing on that day. This is an outsourced model, a fully outsourced model. And so what are we doing as an industry? Are we making life easier for ourselves? I would argue that quite the opposite. Now, many of you are first responders here. Many of you work in incident response. I'm guessing every single person here knows the value of the who is. It's the first thing you do. You want to know the name of the person who registered a domain. And it's imperative. Now, I grant you that the majority of the data in there is probably falsified. There was a statistic in which I saw that they said 13% of who is data is actually accurate. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's still the first thing that you do. So the first thing that we do to investigate a major criminal campaign is use something that is now no longer accessible because of privacy. Now, I grant you, privacy is imperative. I was reminding the security person at El Al Airport about the need for privacy when I was trying to come to Israel yesterday. It didn't go so well. It was 2 hours, would you believe? But nonetheless, we're facing an issue in which the very critical assets that we depend upon are being targeted and compromised. Nation states are being blacked out because of major attacks, and we are effectively limiting our ability as law enforcement liaison. Even law enforcement aren't having access to this information. We're making it more and more difficult for ourselves to conduct these types of campaigns. And I'm guessing everybody in this room was aware of this. You all knew about GDPR when, 5 years ago? When did you hear about it? 5, 6, 7 years ago? We knew this was coming. And yet, we as an industry decided to go and fight amongst ourselves because, I don't know, blacklisted, AV is dead, or other ridiculous arguments that we decided to have amongst ourselves. And in the meantime, the very tools that we need to protect our infrastructure are being taken away. And that's on us. We have fell asleep at the wheel as an industry, and it's about time that we started to do something, which is, rather than fighting amongst ourselves for more Twitter followers, is do everything we can to try to preserve the tools that we need. Now, I do want to share with you some good news. Like, these talks are always the most depressing. You kind of talk about the worst things in the world and everyone walks away depressed. So I do want to share with you some positivity. Now, in 2016, we co-founded an initiative with the Dutch police, Europol, and Kaspersky Lab called No More Ransom. Now, I hope everybody's heard of this. But this was that moment where, everybody's seen Lord of the Rings, right? Well, we're in tech, right? So of course everybody's seen Lord of the Rings. That moment when Gandalf is fleeing from the mines of Mordor, and he's being chased, and he puts his staff down, and he says, "You shall not pass." The moment was when hospitals were being targeted, patients weren't getting care. I mean, like, people were going into A&E and being turned away. And we said, look, enough is enough. So we co-founded this initiative, and the purpose of the initiative is to give free tools to people that have been hit by ransomware. And the bad guys don't like it, by the way. This is actually a code excerpt from the GandCrab ransomware. It's the most prevalent form of ransomware for some time now, actually. And as you can see, their command and control server was nomoreransom.bit. So, of course, they are doing everything that they can to try to bring the site down. In fact, the amount of DDoS traffic that we face, I would argue, is probably one of the most targeted websites that I certainly know of. And they know who we are. They've done their research on us. So we had a look at it over a 36-hour window of No More Ransom, and the #1 IP address that was targeting No More Ransom, ironically, was using a VPS that was actually 3 miles from my house. My wife didn't laugh at that, by the way. She didn't find that funny at all. So they know who we are. But I'll tell you what, we will continue to release tools on this particular platform. We started with 7, and as of yesterday, we hit 85 tools. The most prevalent form of ransomware is GandCrab. By the way, we released a free tool yesterday via Bitdefender and the Romanian police that is now publicly on the website. And we have to do something, because how many of you have actually had a phone call from somebody that's been hit by ransomware? All right, so the phone call says, I've been hit. I can't access my files. And you say, that's ransomware. What shall I do? Use your backup. And the response is, huh? That's the response, right? And then your advice is, they say, well, what shall I do? And you never say pay, right? Because you know that it funds crime. So what do? Invent a time machine and go back and take photos of your children again. That's it. Those are the options you have. So now, please, 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 if you take nothing else from my talk today, is www.nomoreransom.org. I have posted the links to the GandCrab decryptor as well. And now you have a third option. Don't pay criminals. Actually, back your data up first. But if you're like every other person that I know, then at least you have this as a backup and as an option. Now, I want to pause here for a second and just to give you the perspective of why this is important. This was actually taken from WannaCry, and I know it's kind of like bad juju to keep using slides of WannaCry because it's like Stuxnet, right? Everybody got sick of those slides, and now you do WannaCry. But this is important because this is actually the impact of what we do. See, there's a misconception that we work in an industry that's related to computers, because that's not what we do. The impact of a cyber event is bigger than that. This was a comment that was taken from the BBC website that fateful Friday. That Friday when the next 2 weeks of all of our lives was completely swallowed up by a test, I guess, but not ransomware for sure. Now, on the Saturday, the next day, and I'd probably had like an hour's sleep, we had to go into Hammersmith Hospital in London. We have a family member that's very sick. And it was quite strange because they'd completely disabled the internet and Wi-Fi for all patients. There was a precaution. And it's a wise precaution. Now, I know you read the headlines about this many operations cancelled and this was the impact. But I actually saw this with my own eyes. And the individual that I went to see, we sat and talked, and I said, well, this WannaCry stuff's a bit crazy, isn't it? And he says, yeah. He said, they've switched off the internet, and the nurses and doctors have been running back and forth. Now, my phone at the time was sitting on the bed, and it kept buzzing because we had to have the McAfee response. We had law enforcement on our case. I was getting about 400 messages an hour across every vector you can think of. And my daughter, who's like 13 at the time, says, Dad, I can't wait to get 400 messages an hour. I only get one. And I was like, I really wish I only got one message an hour. One message a minute would be nice. But I remember sitting and having this conversation with him, and he's like, all right, look, you're going to have your surgery on Wednesday. Are you okay about that? And he goes, no problems, really in good spirits. Now, something as small as just taking away internet access to somebody in a hospital, you'd think is a minor issue. But if you're in there 24/7, your only output, your only connection to the outside world is the internet. Your ability to communicate, the ability to listen to music, your ability to be able to read, communicate, connect. And when I went back on the Wednesday, honestly, his mood had completely crashed. And that was the smallest impact that you can think of. Imagine if you're a parent of a sick child going into an accident and emergency and being said, I'm sorry, our computer systems aren't working. You have to go to another hospital. I'm not trying to do this to shock anybody, but I think it's important that we recognize the role that we play in society. We literally are there to preserve a free, a democratic process. You might have seen the research I did on the misinformation campaigns against elections. I mean, I'm from London, and one of the questions I ask is, Would Brexit have happened without Twitter and Facebook? And it's a major issue because my children's future is impacted by a vote that potentially was manipulated. Would the White House have the same person if it wasn't for the same platforms? So I think it's important that we recognize the role that we have. You might be the incident response for a small team or for a small company, but your ability to be able to share and communicate that information in a timely fashion to your peers may well protect hundreds of thousands of dollars, which in turn will preserve the investment of these organizations into hiring more people in Tel Aviv. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but honestly, we've seen those impacts. The impact to GDP for a cyber in Germany is 1.29%. 1.29% of Germany's GDP is lost because of malware and espionage. How many jobs do you think that costs the economy? So I think it's important we recognize what we have, and I have got a few minutes, and I did promise the team that we'd share some latest information. And why this all kind of comes into play is because our role is to provide research for the community so that we can better identify the perpetrators behind these attacks. So we've just posted our latest research on the Ryuk ransomware. Ryuk is a particularly nasty form of ransomware in which they charge up to about $100,000 for the decryption keys. They target organizations and enterprises across the world. So we only published this an hour ago, so I didn't have time to write the slides. But if you are interested in this or any of the research, we do post things on Twitter, and we launched our own podcast as well, rather amusingly called Comrade Cyber. So you can guess what we talk about. But look, with that, thank you very much, and it's great to be in Tel Aviv for the first time. Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Hello.
Thank you. As always, a pleasure to listen to you, Ron. You mentioned in passing that you don't think WannaCry was intended as a ransomware. Indeed, it wasn't very successful as a ransomware because it only raised a small amount of money to pay. What do you think it actually was? And was it a mistake? Did it get out into the wild before its time?
So it's a great question, and I've got another talk about it, so I can probably spend an hour talking about it. I think WannaCry was one of those where it didn't make any sense. So, it's the most effective delivery or propagation method for malware or ransomware that we've ever seen in history. So you have this piece of code which delivers ransomware, the best in the world. And then when you're infected, they say, why don't you contact us offline and and we'll send you a decryption key. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you do all of this investment to roll out ransomware and then not have a way to be able to provide decryption keys? The other thing is there a single person here that knows anybody that paid the ransom and actually got their data back or the decryption key? Not for WannaCry. I know of 5 companies.
For other ransomware, yes.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. I don't think it fits the modus operandi of traditional ransomware. And equally, the other thing that kind of got me, and listen, I don't know, I'm speculating. The other thing that I started to think of is, why would you have a kill switch? That just is the most ridiculous thing in the world. So it was actually around about that time that I came up with this term called pseudo-ransomware. And so the assertion was, this is pseudo-ransomware. If I had to guess, it was a test of some case. And then, of course, we had NotPetya, and that was definitely pseudo-ransomware. That was destruction. And then we had Bad Rabbit, and that was definitely pseudo ransomware. So I think like WannaCry, Bad Rabbit, and NotPetya introduce us to this concept of pseudo ransomware. So not actually the purpose of, not true ransomware. And same as Hermes, actually. I talk about Ryuk, but Hermes was used to target the Bank of Taiwan, and that was used as a distraction while they stole money.
Same thing happened in Chile.
In Chile, yeah.
A wiper which was a distraction for, stealing money from Swift servers.
Well, but that's the interesting part now, is we never really know who's behind the attack, but we always know the purpose. A DDoS is meant to disrupt your environment. But now we can't even rely on that. So now you're seeing these blended attacks. So that's what I'm saying. I think it's getting harder for us. But we'll get them. No worries. Hey, there's a microphone there.
Why is the ransomware wave declining now?
Well, I think the volume is declining, but I don't think, like, we say there's one new malware sample every 5 seconds. And so I think the volume is decreasing. And like, you saw cryptojacking kind of almost taking over. But it's not going away. I mean, it's still significant. Ryuk and Gandcrab and SamSam and all of these variants have been really aggressive. But I think in part, and I'm really hopeful the answer is, because less people are paying the ransom. I hope. And so with cryptojacking, you're definitely going to get paid, whereas with ransomware, you might not. But I think we've got to be careful using the term ransomware is declining, because then we kind of go, oh, it's going to go away. But it's still very, very aggressive and still significant.
Okay, but I would expect that as the ransomware attacks are becoming more and more well known to the general population, then perhaps more people would pay the ransom, because certain attacks would have the reputation behind them for delivering the decryption keys.
I love you. I really physically love you so much. You think like me. You think, so great case in point, right? When CryptoLocker came out, my mum phones me up. She says, I've heard about this new virus I have to download. Where can I download this virus? And I'm like, Mum, you know the job I do. It's not a virus. It's a removal tool against the CryptoLocker. The general population have absolutely no clue what we do. The general population don't back up their data. The general population pays ransom. I mean, I'll send you a link of a story of a poor Irish woman that had to buy Bitcoin and had to work out how to do it. We understand, like, cybersecurity is not hard. I genuinely think the work we do is not difficult. If you maintain good backups, if you don't click on links, if you change your passwords, all of these things, we could prevent nearly all of the major malware out there. But people don't do that. We've failed as an industry to articulate what needs to happen. People still don't understand what we do. And there's been, water treatment plants being taken out, electrical plants being taken, like this is everything, and they still don't understand. And I think if people thought more like you and me and just did the basics, then I don't think ransomware would be anywhere near the issue it is today. And even organizations, by the way. Organizations are being targeted by SamSam because they've got weak RDP credentials, allowing criminals into their environment. That's the stupidest thing in the world. Don't you think? We found an airport, an international airport in the United States that had an open RDP connection out to the world. And we contacted them and they said, don't you dare publish our name. And we said, we will never publish your name. Don't you dare publish it. And I said, it's coming out. Tough luck. This is an airport. Sorry, this is feels like a soapbox. Oh, but I agree. I think you're absolutely correct. If more people understood the basics, we wouldn't be even talking about 90% of the stuff we read about today. But they don't. Nobody cares about security. Nobody cares. Which is why we have to change the discussion. Don't talk about cybersecurity. Don't talk about, malware and APTs. Talk about the impact. That's what's going to get people concerned about this. But nobody gives a shit about anything we do. And I'm sorry to use language like that, but you know that, right? How many of you have had to rebuild your parents' laptop because they clicked on the same link again? How many of you have had to go to somebody's house and say to them, why didn't you back up? I told you to back up. How many of you have gone and said, well, I'm sorry, your iPhone's been stolen. Did you enable Find My iPhone? No, I didn't. Do you know what I mean? Like the same mistake time after time after time after time. And we can sit here and blame them, or we can try to change the discussion that we have with them. Sorry, that's like the world's longest answer to the simplest question.
Awareness.
Awareness doesn't work. I think understanding is probably the key. Okay.
Any more questions for Mr. Raj? Anyone else?
Thank you.
Thank you.